Now, as you saw there, President Uhuru Kenyatta addressing the nation. The president also on Thursday rejected the 2018 financial bill, and his rejection of the bill now puts to rest the ongoing stalemate over the 16% value-added tax on fuel. Our reporter Abubakar Abdullahi joins us live from our city centre studios. Abubakar, can you tell us how far the bill has come and what next?
Good afternoon, Malika. I can hear you very well. In relation to the twists and turns of this story, the involvement, of course, started off in 2013 when first Parliament passed the financial bill which imposed 16% value-added tax on fuel. It gave a three-year implementation period, grace period rather, of 3 years to 2016. And as the deadline of 2016 was fast approaching, they suspended it with another 2 years from 2016 to 2018. The latest of suspensions, again, Parliament 2 weeks ago suspended this bill to 2020. Even though the September 1st deadline took effect, meaning that the VAT came into effect in September despite Parliament, of course, suspending it. Parliament was also seeking the grace of the President in terms of not rejecting the bill, but barely a day now since the President rejected this bill, and of course his statement earlier on saying that he has proposed a 50% cut on the 16%, which means fuel will now retail with an 8% value-added tax. This eventually will also mean that there is a drop in the number of course, the prices of fuel rather, from 127 shillings, which then had the 16% value-added tax, to what the President says is 118 shillings. This journey also has put the Treasury and Parliament at crossroads. Of course, suspicions being rife to the extent of Parliament threatening to impeach Treasury CS Henry Rotich. Now that the implementation is in effect and the President, of course, saying it will further be reduced to 8%, this will need again Parliament to approve or even reject, which some sort of has been a pull and push between Parliament, Treasury, and now the latest being the President rejecting Parliament's proposal, but rather also proposing a new 8% cut in the VAT tax. Treasury, by doing so, by implementing the 16%, was aiming at collecting around 70 billion shillings as an extra revenue from this. Of course, now that it has been cut, they'll have to seek other ways. The 16% value-added tax on fuel, of course, means Kenyans will have to delve deeper into their pockets. But now at 8%, of course, we are covering the story, seeking the opinions of Kenya, whether the 8% is favorable to them or of course, the 16%, which is not favorable, or will they have expected the President to drop this altogether? But Parliament, of course, suspended this to 2022, but again, the President last night rejected the suspension, the further suspension of the 16% value-added tax. So from 2013 to as late as an hour ago when the President suggested, rather proposed the 8%, this has been the development in terms of this story. Malika?
Thank you very much, Abubakar, there, giving us the details on the fact that President Uhuru Kenyatta, of course, yesterday rejected the finance bill, and today in his State of the Nation address said that the VAT on petroleum products he has proposed that it should be slashed from 16% to 8%. Now that will actually take super petrol from 127 to 118 shillings, diesel from 115 to 107. I want to bring in, of course, our in-house economist, that is Ken Gishinga now. Ken, what do you have to say about these reductions, and do you think that this is enough to salvage the pockets of Kenyans?
Well, what the President said was we have to balance short-term pains with long-term gains. And he has to do a very tough balancing act, because on one side he has IMF giving him a lot of pressure. IMF have said it's important to put the VAT on fuel, but on the other side, he said he's felt the cry of Kenyans because the cost of living has gone up. So in the sense, he's had to appease both parties by compromising and maybe reducing the VAT to 8% on fuel products. So I think possibly that's the best he could have done in the current scenario. But you're right. I think a lot of people are thinking long term, and they're saying the cost of living in Kenya has been going up for quite some time. What can we do to make sure that we are still within an affordable country, because that's a lot of people feel things are getting beyond control. So I think those are the things that he really has to think through with Parliament, with all the arms of government, in creating a framework that can take this country towards what he calls shared prosperity.
Yes, and through his State of the Nation address, he also said that, he wants to redirect some of the resources, for instance, to different arms of government to be able to create a more, let's say, momentum in the fight against corruption, for instance. Do you think this is economically feasible? I
think by him allocating more money to the judiciary, more money to the office of the public prosecutor, I think that's a good move, because every index in Kenya says corruption is the biggest barrier to Kenya's economic progress. So the more money that we can put into fighting corruption, the better. That said, we have to be careful that as we cut back, because he's pursuing what they call austerity measures, it's very important that we don't cut back from necessary service delivery that will compromise the lives of Kenyans. So it is a balancing act that the president has to do it today and for the rest of his tenure.
All right. And what do you think in general about the fact that he did not directly address the IMF? He did not directly say IMF and, the fact that we have, of course, passed that expiration date for the precautionary loan of close to $100 billion.
That's a good question, Malika. And I would say he already knows it's in the public domain. You have to be a Kenyan who doesn't read the newspapers to know that the IMF was not behind this VAT increase. So I think he already knows it's in the public domain. And I think he wants to focus Kenyans' effort on building the country, not on blaming the Western donors, but on building the country. So I think in that sense, he was in a sense asking Kenyans, can we sacrifice a bit for a better Kenya for tomorrow, with or without our development partners? Because it's not just the IMF out there. There's China that has been funding Kenya. There's other countries that have been funding Kenya. In fact, the Chinese funding Kenya is more of a bigger story. So I think him not making references to external bodies was in a way to focus Kenyans' initiatives on, we're here in Kenya, and Kenya is in our hands, and we want to bring on a better Kenya for our children. I think that's the message that he wanted to focus more on.
Absolutely. However, that 100 billion shilling precautionary loan, of course, has been being talked about very much widely. And CS Henry Rotich did say that he does not expect this to create any sort of turmoil in the market. How far do you think that it is prudent to rely on the maintenance of stability of the economy to carry forward?
Well, we have to ask ourselves, what was the purpose of the precautionary facility? That $100 million is supposed to protect Kenya from international shocks in the international systems. But if you look at the central bank reserves of dollars, we have about 6 months of reserves of dollars. That is more than enough than what the country needs. And in essence, that is more than enough to see us off. So we don't need the precautionary facility. I've said that now, and I've said that in the past.
All right. And after all of this has now occurred, what do you think is the way forward for Kenya?
I think the way forward, first of all, fighting corruption. I'm glad a lot of money is being thrown into fighting corruption. I think that's the biggest barrier to Kenya's progress. But moving forward, I think we need to think about increasing our tax base, because only 3 million Kenyans are paying taxes in a country of 49 million people. So we have to think of how do we increase the tax base, and especially areas that have been neglected in the past. What innovative ways and what can economic history teach us on how to raise tax in a legitimate way, so that 1 year, 2 years down the road, we are not bothering businessmen with more VAT taxes. I think that's the bigger conversation we need to have.
All right, thank you very much.